Tissues are groups of cells of similar function and structure, including their surrounding intercellular material called matrix. There are 4 basic tissue types. They are epithelium, connective, muscle, and nervous. Each type differs in appearance and in function. Epithelial tissue may be divided into 2 main groups. All glands have epithelium which secrete or excrete. Membranes also contain epithelium. You will concentrate on the epithelia of membranes. Membrane epithelia may protect, absorb, secrete, or excrete. Epithelia are classified in 2 ways. They may be classified by the shape of their cell. Those that are flat and irregular in shape are squamous. Tall, narrow cells are columnar. And cells that are more or less square are cuboidal. Epithelia may also be classified by the number of layers that make them up. Epithelia only 1 cell layer thick are called simple. Epithelia made of more than 1 cell layer are called stratified. Some epithelia line cavities that experience a lot of wear and tear. For example, the mouth and esophagus, skin, rectum, and vagina are of this type. Stratified squamous epithelia is layered to protect those linings. All covering and lining epithelia are attached to deeper tissue at a basement membrane. The opposite edge is free at the surface or the cavity space. You cannot see each cell, but you can see the many dark spots which are the nuclei of individual cells. The example you are viewing is of the esophagus. It is similar to other locations where stratified squamous epithelia are found. At a magnification of 400, individual cells can be clearly seen. Notice their irregular shape. Not all epithelia are exposed to wear and tear, as we see in the stratified squamous type. In fact, most do not experience wear and tear at all. Most covering and lining epithelia are strictly secretory or excretory. Simple columnar is a secretory type epithelium. This example is from the intestines and is folded into many finger-like projections that increase the surface area. This improves secretion and absorption in the intestines. The arrow is demonstrating the single layer. Both the basement and the free edge are visible. Notice the dark line of nuclei near the basement. At 400 magnifications, you can clearly see the nuclei. You cannot see the cell borders, but each cell can be visualized by noting the number of nuclei. The arrow points first to the cytoplasm at the free edge, then along the basement where the nuclei are located. You probably know the digestive tract secretes mucus as well as enzymes and acid. Occasionally, you can see cells that secrete mucus. These are goblet cells. Other than the one pointed out by the arrow, you can clearly see 2 or more on the screen. Pseudostratified columnar epithelium is a variation of simple columnar epithelium. The term pseudo means false. Pseudostratified, therefore, means false layers, only appearing to be stratified. This colorful example is from the trachea. Remember that epithelia are located along free margins. One border is exposed on a surface, and in the case of the trachea, the opening or lumen is the windpipe. The other border is the attached basement. Actually, most of the remaining tissue below is cartilage supporting the trachea. .400 magnifications allows you to examine the nuclei. Observe that the nuclei do not form an even row, but appear as if they are layered. In fact, they are not. Hence, they are pseudo-stratified. Once again, notice basement, free margin. Basement, free margin. Another quality of pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium is the presence of cilia. Cilia are projections of the cell membrane at the free margin. Cilia move in a sweeping fashion in order to move something within the lumen of the organ. In the case of the trachea, cilia sweep mucus, dust, pollen, etc., out of the respiratory organs and into the throat. Perhaps the most difficult epithelium to see and understand is cuboidal epithelium. To most people, the cells do not look square, and in some examples it doesn't seem to have a free border. This example is of the kidney. The kidney is actually an organ of thousands of tiny tubes. These tubes and their cuboidal cell lining are seen better at 400 magnifications. The arrow is pointing out cuboidal cells. Observe that this cuboidal tissue does have a free border. The lumen, however, is very narrow. You can't see the cell membrane, but you can see the evenly spaced blue nucleus of each cell. Mentally compare these cells with the other epithelia you have observed. They are more or less square. They certainly aren't tall and narrow like columnar, nor are they different irregular shapes like squamous. recall that tissues are cells of similar structure and function, including their intercellular substance or matrix. Also remember that there are 4 basic types of tissue: epithelium, connective, muscle, and nervous. This tape will consider connective tissue. The basic functions of connective tissue are to support, cushion, connect, or bind. Connective tissues are located throughout the body, below skin, between muscles, and among the viscera. The types of connective tissue are highly varied and include cartilage, tendons and ligaments, bones, blood, and others. I will discuss 6 types with you, noting peculiarities of each type. Cartilage is composed of cells and a smooth, homogeneous matrix. It varies in flexibility. The cartilage of the ears is elastic and highly flexible. In the nose, it is called hyaline and is flexible, but not so much so as the ear. These types provide support. Pads of cartilage in the spinal column are called discs. Their purpose is to cushion. There are few cells in cartilage. Most of the tissue is matrix. Each cell occupies a small space in the matrix called a lacuna. The outer line is the border of the lacuna. The cartilage cell is called chondrocyte. Cartilage is among the most characteristic of the connective tissues. That is, there are few cells and much matrix, and the function is characteristically supportive. Bone is a common name for osseous tissue. Bone is the most rigid of the connective tissues. Its function is primarily supportive and protective. It is, however, also a storehouse of calcium and phosphorus salts. In addition, blood cells are formed in the marrow of the bone, and fat is stored in the large cavity of long bones. Bone is made of units called Haversian systems. Each system has a central hole called the Haversian canal. Small blood vessels and nerves are transmitted through these canals. There appear to be rings surrounding each Haversian canal, creating an appearance much like the annual rings in a tree. These rings are called concentric lamellae. They are actually layers of calcium salts separated by layers of bone cells. The bone cells, or osteocytes, look like black spots in the tissue. Actually, the black spots are spaces, or lacuna, in which the osteocytes are located. Osteocytes are responsible for producing the hard calcium matrix of bone. Realer tissue, or loose connective tissue, is the most characteristic of the connective tissues. The cells of a realer tissue are called fibroblasts. These cells synthesize fibers made of protein. Some are tough collagen fibers, some are elastic fibers. These fibers weave a loose, irregular pattern that enables this tissue to provide flexible support. An example is the tissue attaching skin to underlying muscle. Fibrous, or dense connective tissue, is also composed of fibroblasts and fibers. These fibers, however, are gathered into parallel strands. The large amount of fiber imparts strength. Dense connectives may be known as ligament or tendon, or the gristle that encapsulates muscle. This example is adipose tissue, or fatty tissue. Its basic function is to store fat. The fat may be used to cushion under the skin, especially in the buttock and hip, or to pad organs like the kidneys and intestines. The fat can also insulate against the cold. Fat can be removed and used for energy or other metabolic purposes. There is little matrix in adipose tissue. It is composed mostly of adipose cells. The cells appear empty because most of the interior is filled with a single vacuole of fat. The remaining cytoplasm is squeezed against the cell membrane. Blood is a connective tissue, although it obviously doesn't connect or support anything. It belongs to the connective tissues because it develops from other connective tissues. Blood cells are suspended in a fluid called plasma. The most numerous of the blood cells are red blood cells, or erythrocytes. Their function is to carry oxygen throughout the body. They look like donuts because they are thick at the edge and very thin in the center, so thin that light shines through the center quite easily. The white blood cells, or leukocytes, are the least numerous of the blood cells. They look blue or purple to you because they have been stained. They would otherwise not be visible to the eye. The functions of leukocytes include fighting infection and aiding in tissue repair.
Muscle tissue has a unique capability of contraction to produce movement or tension. There are 3 types of muscle tissue: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. In this videotape, we will examine each type of muscle tissue, showing their similarities and differences. Skeletal muscle is attached to bones and functions to move the body through space. This low-power view of skeletal muscle shows that it has a striated or striped appearance. This is due to the arrangement of tiny filaments located within the cell. The following diagram shows how these filaments form the dark and light bands in the cell. Skeletal muscle cells are long threads that extend the entire length of the muscle. Thus, each cell is often referred to as a fiber. Skeletal muscle cells are multinucleated, and each nucleus is located near the border or edge of the cell, as seen in this slide. In review, the major structural characteristics one should remember concerning skeletal muscle is that it has striated cells, with each cell extending the entire length of the muscle. The skeletal muscle cells are multinucleated, with a nucleus appearing at the cell borders. Functionally, skeletal muscle requires nerve stimulation to contract. Skeletal muscle tissue is under voluntary nerve control, meaning we can move our body at will. Cardiac muscle is located in the heart and functions to propel blood through the circulatory system. A 10x magnification of cardiac muscle shows that this tissue is also striated or striped in appearance. A close look at this tissue reveals that its cells are joined end to end, resulting in a branched, interconnected, complex network. Each cell has a single nucleus in the center of the cell. The junction between adjacent cells is specialized for fast nerve impulse transmission and is referred to as an intercalated disc. Now, let us summarize the structural characteristics of cardiac muscle. Like skeletal muscle, it is striated. However, the cells are smaller and form a branching network with intercalated discs between adjacent cells. Each cell has a single nucleus which is in the center of the cell. Functionally, cardiac muscle also differs from skeletal muscle in that it is not under conscious or voluntary nerve control. In fact, this muscle can contract without nerve stimulation and is thus considered an involuntary muscle. As one examines this 10x magnification of smooth muscle, one notices immediately the lack of striations. This muscle is considered a non-striated or smooth muscle. A diagram of smooth muscle illustrates that it is composed of spindle-shaped fibers, each with a central nucleus. This tissue is found in the walls of hollow visceral organs, such as the stomach, bowel, and bladder. It functions to propel substances through or within these organs. Once again, we will emphasize the major structural characteristics of smooth muscles. It is non-striated, has spindle-shaped fibers with a single central nucleus. Functionally, this tissue is like cardiac in that it does not require nerve stimulation for contraction, and hence is also considered an involuntary muscle. At this time, we will examine nerve tissue, specifically the tissue found in the spinal cord responsible for stimulating muscle cells. In addition to stimulating muscles and glands to contract and secrete, nerve tissue also is a sensory tissue that senses changes in the body's external and internal environment. The messages from these sensory nerves are processed by other neurons in the brain and spinal cord for actions and memory. Nerve tissue is composed of cells called neurons. This is a somatic motor neuron responsible for stimulating skeletal muscles. Each neuron may have one or more receiving processes called dendrites and a single sending process called an axon. One cannot always distinguish between axons and dendrites in a neuron structurally. Specialized connective tissue cells usually surround neurons and function to support, connect, insulate, and protect these neurons. These connective tissue cells are called neural glia cells or glial cells. As you can see, neural glial cells are much smaller than the neuron and do not share any nervous tissue functions per se. They cannot conduct nerve impulses and are thus not really classified as nervous tissue. This ends the muscle and nervous tissue review. Thank you for watching. You may find slides of muscle and nerve tissue on the side tables for your own examination. The skin is often referred to as the integument because its general function is to provide a covering for the body. Thus, the tissues of the skin, its organs and appendages such as hair and nails, constitute the integumentary system. This videotape will show you the major microscopic structures of the skin and its appendages and discuss briefly the function of each. This model of the skin shows you schematically that the skin has two well-defined layers. The top, or outermost layer, is the epidermis, while the second layer is called the dermis. Below the skin, varying amounts of adipose tissue or fat may be found. This is referred to as the subcutaneous layer and is the site of subcutaneous injections. Now, let us take a look at a microscopic slide of Caucasian skin using the 10x objective. Note that the epidermis is composed of stratified squamous epithelium, which functions as a tough barrier to microbes and chemicals. This layer has often been further subdivided. Using the 40x objective, one can examine the epidermis more closely. The deepest or most basal layer is the stratum germativum, consisting of columnar cells which constantly undergo mitosis, pushing the new cells upward toward the free surface to replace dead and sloughed off cells. In this basal-most layer, specialized cells called melanocytes may be found to produce a dark brownish-black pigment called melanin. This slide of negroid skin allows one to clearly see the melanin-filled melanocytes. The melanocytes of Caucasian skin are usually only visible when the skin has been exposed to ultraviolet light and is suntanned. The outermost layer of the epidermis consists of dead cells that make up the layer known as the stratum corneum. The cells in this layer are not only dead, but have a specialized protein called keratin that produces a tough barrier for chemicals, microbes, and mechanical injury. Note the calluses on one's own hands or the corns on one's feet. It has a much thicker stratum corneum than normal skin to provide more protection. Note also that the epidermis lacks blood vessels and receives its nutrients from blood vessels in the dermis by diffusion. This limits the growth of the epidermis and explains why the top layers furthest away from nutrition and oxygen die. Now let us examine the dermis of the skin. The dermis is composed primarily of fibrous connective tissue that includes collagen and elastic fibers surrounded by a gel-like substance to provide toughness and elasticity. Embedded in the dermis, one may find sweat glands and oil glands, the sense organs of the skin for touch, temperature, pressure, and pain, blood vessels, hair and hair follicles, and erector pili muscles. This model of the skin shows you how these structures of the skin appear three-dimensionally. Notice that the sweat glands appear as a long coiled tube. When one makes a cross-section of this coiled tube, it appears as a series of round donut-shaped structures as seen in this high-power magnification of a sweat gland. Sometimes one may see a duct to the surface of the skin, as in this slide. The oil or sebaceous gland is a larger, solid-appearing gland often located near the hair follicle, and its ducts secrete their product into the hair follicle. The fatty or oily product give these cells their whitish appearance. Hair and hair follicles can best be examined by studying a slide of the scalp. The hair follicle is composed of epidermal cells that extend into the dermis in a tube-like structure.